When you go to the source of your food, you see the hidden cost. And the hidden costs are the cost to our health and the cost to the landscape and our wildlife and our ecosystems. I think a lot of people, first thing they say is like, I don't like game flavor. And I think that's a shame because anytime I go to a restaurant and I eat beef, I think, oh my gosh, there's no flavor in this, or a chicken tastes like water to me. Porcini mushrooms and chocolate share similar compounds, and when you pair them together, you're getting something really intensely chocolatey. So the porcini in that dessert makes that taste more chocolatey without adding any more sugar.
Danielle, welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
It's good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
I think this is a podcast we've tried to plan recording for a little while now, and so I'm glad we're finally doing it.
Yeah, me too. Last time we chatted was in person at our mutual friend's Hayden's house, and we were having a nice Japanese barbecue dinner with a bunch of wild game. So It's been a while since we chatted. That was an awesome day. I always tell the story of you giving me a bit of a raw access to your backstrap and getting to try that for the first time. That was just mind blowing to me how tasty that was. Just a raw piece of a backstrap.
That was a couple of years ago now, wasn't it?
Yeah, probably like 2 years now.
Gosh, time flies. I think that had to have been access from Hawaii.
Yeah.
Which is funny because I live in Texas and we've got access in our freezer, from the hill country here. But that one actually came from Hawaii.
Yeah, high quality stuff. My first time eating access and the last time since then, I feel like even though they are so abundant, it's not that accessible unless you know someone who's hunted them over there.
Yeah.
So to kind of kick it off, I figured we could maybe start with something I saw in your new book, which we'll get to in a bit. But you make a point in your new book about the food system and there being problems with the food system. And I think this is a good place to start because it kind of goes into your why of your Wild and Whole brand and project. And I think that also aligns super well with why I started my podcast, Your Year of Plenty. So I figured, why not start with that, kind of lay kind of the framework of why should we even care about food and why, the food system as a whole is problematic right now.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to write about in a wild game cookbook. And a lot of people really there's like this division in the world of like wild game and hunting is very like specific and tunnel vision. And when you look at food sustainability in like agriculture industry, it's very much focused on carbon footprint. And I wanted to sort of give a perspective of what it means to like eat consciously and care about the sustainability of our food through the perspective of an outdoorsman and somebody who spends time in nature. Because as I know, and as you know, and anybody else who spends a lot of time outside, our habitats and wildlife is absolutely key and crucial. And, hunting plays a big role in conservation, but agriculture plays a really big role as well into our wildlife and those ecosystems. And so when I started doing some digging into our food system, and I started to look at like what are the real issues with Earth, like when you think about it from like a really top level perspective, and it isn't really carbon, it's actually our loss of biodiversity. And globally, this isn't just North America, but globally, we've lost a lot of species. And biodiversity is every living organism from bacteria in the soil to pollinators and animals, all the fish, all the things. And so we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. And a big part of that is due to our food system, the way that we grow food and raise food is really harmful. And so I wanted to sort of think about that in terms of, getting outside, like, when we go hunting for pheasants or deer hunting, I'm looking at like what are how are these people integrating their crops and how is that affecting the ecosystem? Funny story. We just moved to Rockport, Texas, and we were looking for a house outside of Corpus Christi. And it was a really popular up and coming neighborhood that's that's pretty expensive, and it's like smack dab in the middle of a bunch of agricultural farmland. And we were looking at a house, and then all of a sudden I look up and I see in the backyard um, an airplane dusting over the fields right next to the house. And I was like, absolutely not. I am not
Yeah.
going to grow a garden in this backyard where while they're crop dusting right behind me. And so, and there were dove everywhere. And I was like, gosh, that's a shame. Like it makes you think, like, do I want to eat these dove that are, eating off this field? So that's kind of like where I wanted to start with that, is in that cookbook. And it's funny that I was given, oh gosh, 70,000 words to write in that book, and I wrote 90,000, and that section of the book was substantially larger, and my editor was like, "We gotta cut that down." I had to take out 20,000 words. It was so hard to do. I don't think I think I cut more like 10,000, and they were like, okay with it. It's a cookbook making is once you write the book and then you take the photos, it becomes one master puzzle of fitting it all in on the pages just right, and you have a lot of give and take with words and photos. But I wrote a lot on that chapter because it really meant a lot to me. So so I'm glad we're having a chance to talk about it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the industrial ag system as we know it today is really responsible for a lot of that biodiversity loss. And I just had Matt on from North Bridger Bison. We got a little bit into that
Mhm.
there in that episode. But it's a bummer. And, we've been subsidizing that system. I
Mhm.
just saw, I know you've been to White Oak Pastures, and I just actually, let me pull it up quick because I saw a cool post today from Will Harris from White Oak Pastures where he said, the food that came out of the industrial system was artificially cheap. The price was subsidized by the environment, our wildlife and aquatic life, and our bad health, which I thought was really impactful. And it just really kind of highlights, that that industrial food system is having all these hidden impacts that a lot of us aren't
Oh,
aware
yeah.
about. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I talk about in the book, and I think a lot of people talk about when you go to the source of your food, you see the hidden cost, and the hidden cost are the cost to our health and the cost to the landscape and our wildlife and our ecosystems. Those are the things that people it's hard to care about. It's really hard to care about those things when you don't see it. When you go to the store every day and it's packaged up in plastic, you don't see the animal, you don't see the landscape, and you don't care about it as much. But when you get out there and you see it, you do start to care. When you start to place a higher value on it.
Absolutely. 100%. And then the other side of that is like we're subsidizing that system. That system can then create a lot of food, but the food it's creating is these crops that are used for making these ultra processed foods and ultra processed food ingredients like seed oils. I just learned
Mhm.
actually recently that the number one source of energy for Americans are the seed oils, which is kind of
Oh,
crazy to
it's not.
fathom.
It's not a surprise when you think about our history in health and the anti-fat fad really carried strong. I mean, I still know a lot of people that are like afraid to eat, like if they go to a restaurant and they're eating a ribeye, they're like, "Oh, I don't want to eat the fat." And I'm like, give it to me. I'll
Yeah.
eat
Right.
it. um,
Totally.
I mean, I eat a lot of wild game, so anytime I get fat, I get pretty excited.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but yeah, no, that's not a surprise. In my book, I outline different ways to eat consciously, and a
Right.
big one for me, it was just again, I had to cut a lot out, but there was one little thing on there that was like eat real foods in like whole forms as much as possible. And like I'm not saying that I've got a perfect diet or what do you call it? The ingredients only pantry. Have you seen that?
No, I
Um
gotta look that up.
I do kind of have an ingredients only pantry. I won't lie. But yeah, it's like a trend that people like you go in their pantry and like you don't see like bags of chips and boxes of stuff. You see the ingredients to make stuff. Um and I try to be super conscious for health reasons not to buy processed food, but really those foods are what fuel the the monocropping industry. So like that's part of the problem. And like you were mentioning earlier is subsidization and really, the biggest way to make a change is to make changes to the farm bill. And I'm not going to go into all of that because it's definitely not an area that I'm an expert in by any means. But I do know that there's a lot of conservation organizations that sole purpose is to make changes to the farm bill that are going to help um, improve our landscape, but also make sure that farmers are able to make a profit, because that's I think their livelihoods are very important. I come from a family of farmers in South Dakota, so I'm familiar with that, and we don't have a farm up there anymore, which is a whole nother story. But yeah.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think, the antidote to all that is kind of the way of eating you propose. And you just mentioned too, like eating consciously, that's a big or section in your book. So what does that mean to you, eating consciously?
That's a good question. And because my editors kept saying, like, this is a book about food sustainability. And I was like, I don't want to use that term because I think it's gotten really muddy. The media has really like churned that one up. When you think about sustainability, you think of like real big pro meat or anti meat arguments. And I wanted to see things from a bigger bird's eye view of of eating consciously, which is to say that you are making a conscious effort to understand the story behind where your food comes from. There's a fantastic quote by Michael Pollan that says, oh, gosh, I wish I had it somewhere so don't butcher it. To eat with full consciousness, something about eating with full consciousness is providing the greatest satisfaction. It's the hardest way to eat and to live, but it will give you the greatest satisfaction. And it's basically meaning when you take the time and the energy to learn more about where your food comes from, who's growing it, how that animal was raised, um, the food, the feed that the animal was eating, all of those things, you begin to really start to see the bigger picture of the environment, and you start to care a lot more about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it for me too. It's like eating consciously is like getting closer to your food source, learning the ins and outs of the foods you're eating and really being part of sourcing them, whether
Mhm.
that's gardening, hunting, fishing, foraging, going to meet your farmer and buying locally, because that's where the appreciation comes from for that food. And then for me, at least,
Mhm.
it's once you get into all of that, you kind of really see that most of what's in the grocery shelves are like frankenfoods. They're not coming from nature.
Mhm.
They are created in a manufacturing center, somewhere manufactured, and they just don't have that life, that you get from a real food. And
Yeah.
um, what's bad about those foods is that, yeah, they're calorically rich. They provide energy, but they're nutritionally devoid of all the micronutrients, all the phytonutrients,
Mhm.
all the stuff that actually allows you to thrive. So
Yeah.
eating consciously, I think, is a really important thing. And I'm happy you laid it out in the book, and I'm happy you went back and forth with your editors to have that be part of the book. You know, it makes a cookbook much more special, I
Yeah.
think.
It is, and I wanted this cookbook to be more than just recipes. I wanted it to be sort of a source of inspiration for people who want to think about how they're eating differently. And that could mean a lot of different ways. And what was really important to me, especially today when you think about the rising cost of living, is that this is not a I'm here to make you feel guilty or here to make you feel bad about the way you're eating. It's supposed to be uplifting because this is not like something that can entirely happen overnight. Like when I talk about I hunt for most of my protein or I visit this farm or that farmer, I have a huge garden, all those things, none of those things really happened overnight. It took me a long time to get to this place, and it took a lot of baby steps to get here. And so I don't want anybody to get discouraged or to feel like I'm self-righteous in any way, because I think what I want people to take away is that you can apply some of these things, all of these things, like to do whatever fits your lifestyle, your budget, because it is really expensive to say, "Hey, I'm only gonna buy regenerative raised meat." It's not cheap by any means. Like that's that's really setting aside a big part of your budget. Which, I mean, if you do want to go that route, I highly suggest buying like a quarter or a half cow. Because it's much cheaper than just buying it individually. If you've got the freezer space, which is probably the greatest investment you can have in your home is buy a good freezer. um, but yeah, all those things, they're expensive. Hunting can take a lot of time and it's hard. And so it's not something that you just like can do overnight by any means. And I'm really fortunate to be in this situation I am in where I get to hunt so frequently year round. But also it's one of those things where I've kind of made it my greatest passion in life, and my greatest love in life is food and cooking and sharing it with others, and I want to get as close to the source as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And it isn't an overnight thing. It's definitely a journey, and it should be looked at as a journey and enjoyed that way too. You know, you're kind of going on your own little
Mhm.
hero's journey as soon as you start to care about your food. And a part of that is
Mhm.
also then it allows you to eat more seasonally, which is much closer to how humans have eaten for thousands of years. Like it's much closer to what we're meant to be doing, I think personally. So you talk about that in your book a bit too. I'm curious, how does seasonality kind of influence the recipes you create, and what advice do you have for
Great
people to
question.
to start eating more
That was
seasonal?
it's that was the biggest question, is how do you write a book organized by the seasons when truly the only way to eat seasonal is to eat locally? And so I had to kind of make the biggest snapshot view I could over eating seasonally. And then like in each chapter opener, I kind of gave like a little bit more of like in the South, this is coming into season, and in the North, you're still eating this. But there's a lot of crossover. Like and in the spring, morels and asparagus are pretty standard no matter where you're at. Even in Texas. But the one thing that I wanted to make a mention is I think a lot of people and gardeners think of the seasons based on our the equinox and the solstice. Like that marks the changing of the seasons on a calendar. There's a date on the calendar where people say, "Okay, it's pumpkin spice latte time. Everybody get um but it doesn't really work that way. Like, I've lived in both North Dakota and then in Texas, and like extreme opposite places on North America, and and it's the changes in the weather pattern that dictate what a season is. So it's not that we have different foods in different seasons. It's that we experience the seasons at different points in time. In Texas, we start our tomatoes in like I put them in the ground in February. You guys wouldn't even dare think of doing something like that because it's frozen. It's freezing. Um, so but there is a time where you are getting those things. So like it's just that like our spring happens way faster than your spring, and it happens for just a short little window before it's gone and summer takes over. And then summer is like this long, it takes forever. But you guys experience fall way before we do. And it's so that's kind of the way that I approach the seasons, is paying attention to the changes in the weather. And that's what I love the most about this book, the way that it's organized, is I wanted people to get outside and get excited about whatever season they're living in. And I like to tell that through the stories. When you really start to stay in tune, like with what's happening in the changing seasons, it's seeing the first wildflower pop open in a spring, and I know, okay, this is that time of the year. The dewberries are going to come out soon, or just little moments like that, where in the fall we're right in the migration corridor for butterflies and pollinators, and it's just so fun that when I see that swarm of butterflies, I know that it's time for the second planting of fall tomatoes. Yes, we have 2 tomato seasons. We get fall tomatoes. That's how hot it is here. But I think that's kind of a cool way of approaching food.
Yeah, I would agree. And engaging in the wild food and gardening, that really allows you to be in tune with those seasons and also eat more seasonally. Again, going back to how our ancestors have done it forever. That's like, that
Mhm.
was such a big part of their life. Today we have all this convenience. And there's a pretty cool meme I've been seeing recently going around that's like, convenience is the loss of skill, right? Because we lose those skills. So I'm happy you're out there also, promoting getting back to those traditions and learning those skills again so that we can eat more seasonally and eat more like our
Mhm.
ancestors have. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's your book, Wild and Whole. I think it's really awesome. So people should definitely go check it out. It's already available, right? Everywhere
No, next week,
next
October
week.
8th.
All right. So by the time this
I don't
drops,
know when
it
this
should,
podcast comes out, but yeah.
I think by the time it drops, it should be available, and we'll put a link down below. But I'm just curious, what what are some of the recipes you're most excited about in that book? There's a lot in there.
There's a lot, and I'll say, it's the first, I don't know if it'll be the only, it's the first cookbook where you're gonna find both wild game and vegetarian recipes. Um, that was kind of an important one to me when thinking about this, because I don't, again, like I was saying earlier, I am not on a, like, eat meat, don't meat eat, like, thing. I think it's all about, like, to me, the reason why I put vegetarian recipes was because when I very first started hunting, I kind of made a pact that I only wanted to eat wild game. Um, the protein. Only wanted my protein source to be from wild foods that we had hunted or fished, and it was it was hard, really hard to do, and to make that meat stretch as long as you could. And I think the only way I was able to do it for a long time was incorporating more meatless meals. And what that taught me as a cook was so much about ingredients and about food. And I think I grew as a cook and a recipe developer from from only cooking meatless meals, because a lot of times meat is the star of the plate. And don't get me wrong, I obviously love it, but I think vegetables are very understated many times, and I think eating more vegetables is a very very good thing. I try to eat really. If you look at most of what I eat, it's like meat and something green all the time. So that's why I included that, is to sort of pay tribute to to this time where, sometimes I don't have enough meat in the freezer and you have to get creative. And so that's why that's in there. And I also really wanted to include desserts. Have 2 desserts in every chapter. And I wanted those desserts to be something really fun that really played into seasonality, and something that you may get from the garden, or something you may get in while you're out foraging. So, um, were you there on that? Did you go for you were you foraging with us that one time with Hayden?
No, I
I
heard
can't
about it with the
remember.
porcini.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so that porcini, Matt took that photo, and that's in that book. If you look at that, that was from that day. And that's the first time I've seen like a real bolete out in the wild, like an edible edible one. And so that was really cool for me. And so I have a dessert in the fall chapter. It uses dried porcini, not fresh porcini, because when you dry it, that dehydration really intensifies those umami flavors. And porcini it's rich. It's great. It's so earthy, and I wanted to pair it in a dessert with chocolate. So I had the luxury of going on this trip for work. I was filming an episode for Sourced, and it was actually about truffles. And I learned a lot about aromatic qualities of ingredients, because that's really what makes a truffle special. And I started to think about that, and how ingredients that pair together are ingredients pair well together because they share aromatic compounds. And so porcini mushrooms and chocolate share similar compounds. And when you pair them together, you're getting something really intensely chocolatey. So the porcini in that dessert makes that taste more chocolatey without adding any more sugar. So I think a lot of people, when you're trying to make something chocolate rich, what do people do? They add more sugar. And so the porcini was like a really fun way to really intensify that flavor. It's so decadent, but it's not the kind of thing where you taste it and you're like, oh, it's tastes psychedelic. Because it did. Whenever I was recipe testing, I was putting way too much in it, and my husband's like, don't, this tastes like a trip. But I pulled back. And so I could serve this to people and you would never know that there were mushrooms in it, but without it, it's just not quite the same. So that's one
Yeah, that
recipe I'm pretty excited about.
that's fascinating. I never thought about using a wild mushroom in a dessert. I didn't even see that recipe in
Mhm.
there, so I'm gonna have to go check that out. That's really cool. And then also like thinking about pairing those aromatics. How can we,
Mhm.
if you're trying to do that at home, what should we be looking for to kind of find those pairings?
Well, I think it takes a little bit of there's a little bit of studying and research to sort of understand categories and flavors. I always say you eat with your eyes first, but truly you eat with your nose first. You can taste things, like your sense of smell, what you're perceiving will dictate how you taste that food and how you perceive it. And so that's what I mean when I say like those aromatic qualities, having compounds that go together. There's a really great book. What's it called? It's in this room somewhere. Like the flavor index, I want to say. A chef went through and had basically a computer system categorize aromatic compounds from a bunch of different ingredients, and he created a wheel that sort of showed uh pairings that went well together. And it's a really fascinating book, but you can break it down into like things that are like alliums, dairy, sulfurous things like onions, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got meaty things like, beef and chicken or venison, and then you've got different types of spices, and then you've got flavors of fruits, and so that way you can kind of categorize things and see how they pair together. But it's a fascinating book for anybody interested.
Yeah, if you can find the name and send it to me, that'd be cool. I can add it in the episode description as a resource. That would be cool. I need to get that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fun one.
Yeah, overall, I'm very excited about your book, and especially, of course, the wild game cooking aspect of it. And I think that's what a lot of people here in the podcast that are listening will appreciate too. But wild game cooking can be a bit intimidating for beginners, I would say. So I'm curious, like, what are some common mistakes people make when preparing wild game meat, and how can they avoid them?
I would say the biggest one is first assuming that you have to cover up the flavor. I think a lot of people, first thing they say is like, I don't like game flavor. And I think that's a shame, because anytime I go to a restaurant and I eat beef, I think, oh my gosh, there's no flavor in this, or a chicken tastes like water to me. And if you've ever had like something grass fed or a chicken that's been pastured, it tastes better. It just tastes more robust. And wild game is the same way. It is not something to cover up. It is something to embrace and to highlight in whatever it is that you're cooking. But yeah, so that's the first thing I would say is always change your perspective on like the gamey flavor. But two, especially like with venison, just don't overcook it. Most people overcook it. Venison, duck, anything dark meat, um, like sharp-tailed grouse would be another one of those things. You want that to be still pretty pink in the middle. You don't want to overcook it. And I mean, even with like game birds like pheasant, I think a lot of people think it's like chicken and it needs to be like super white all the way through. I like to eat turkey and pheasant and partridge with just a hint of blush pink to it.
Yeah, those are great tips.
And the main reason is not just for like the actual doneness, but wild game is so incredibly lean that it lacks the fat to like sort of provide that like moisture in your mouth. Like whereas like if you overcook chicken or beef, that fat is like an insurance, so you don't really notice that it's overcooked. But when you're eating wild game and there's no fat to it, you notice it immediately, and it's going to taste really dry and probably be a little too tough.
Totally. And I think along with that also goes just understanding the different parts of the animal, right? Like once you kind of understand all the different cuts of meat you can get, then you can also from there go and figure out how to cook them properly.
Oh, yeah. And there's a chapter at the very beginning about working with wild game, and I wanted to sort of break down meat processing and simplify it to just two things. There are tough cuts and there are tender cuts, and there's only two ways of cooking it. Tough cuts, low and slow, tender cuts, hot and fast. And that's like all you need to know. I mean, there's like exceptions to this rule, for sure. But like from a really general point of view, that's all you need to know. And so like I kind of have I have a little butcher chart that shows like the muscles on a deer and what they are. And it's like, okay, in a paragraph form, you'll see tough and tender. And then if you go to the very back of the book in the resource section, I list all the different techniques for tough cuts. So like I've got braising, smoking, soup and stew making, like those kinds of things. And so if you've got a cut and you're like, I don't know what to do with it, you say, okay, you could see that muscle. There it is. It's tough. Go to the back and be like, okay, here are all the recipes I can make with that. So I wanted to kind of make the the book easy to figure out what to make, because I think too many times people have something and they say, okay, I have a venison roast. What do I do with it? And if you look through my recipes, you're not going to find a recipe that's like, well, that's not true. There is a roast venison, but that was a bad example. Um, the muscles are very interchangeable, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. And I usually follow that rule too, the either slow and low or hot and fast. But recently we just, grabbed the venison roast and we're like, okay, well, we don't have time to cook this now for 3-4 hours, braise it, make a soup. This is all we have thought for tonight. Let's see, can we make this tender? And what we ended up doing was just like pounding the crap out of it with a tenderizer and just cutting it into really thin and very thin fajita style strips and then giving that a quick sear. So I think there are ways,
Yeah.
to take those tougher cuts and still make them tender like that.
Yeah, if you cut it against the grain, and it depends on which one you're talking about. I mean, the shanks or the neck, it's not going to happen. But if you've got the bottom round on the outside of a deer's hindquarter, like that one is it's got a really long grain line, and so you can cut it against the grain. And like what you're saying, I've made cutlets out of it and have had success. A little bit tough, but you're right, you don't have to braise it for 5 hours.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, though, of what we are just saying, you were mentioning at the beginning of the segment here, like, don't cover up the flavor, and I agree with that, but sometimes you just get that really gamey piece of meat. I don't mind it usually, but for people who do, what are some good ways to cover it up? Do you have any go-tos you use for that?
Okay, so if you've got this is a funny one. The first time I ever had jackrabbit was in North Dakota, and I thought, this isn't so bad. I don't know what people are complaining about. And I had it in a stew, and I was like, this is fine. I think cottontail is certainly better, but whatever. Because jackrabbit's a darker meat compared to like cottontail being like a whiter meat, and so I went quail hunting in New Mexico, and it turned into what I call a rabbit extravaganza because there not as many quail and a whole lot of rabbits. And so we just shot a bunch of rabbits. And the jackrabbits there, I can tell you, were not good. They were not the same jackrabbits as North Dakota jackrabbits. And that has a lot to do with the food source. And so in those scenarios, like with that rabbit, it's a darker, like more of a red meat. So you want to pair it in like a recipe that you would think of going with like a beef or venison. And I think I did curry. I can't remember, but anything with really bold flavors help quite a bit.
Yeah, I think curry is a great example
Yeah.
there. That's what I was actually going to say too. Those Indian spices will really help, big time. In Germany, they do a lot of juniper. Usually, wild game seasoning will always have juniper in there. That's another one I think that really pairs well, but also masks a bit of the gamey flavor, I would say. And yeah, there are ways to make that gaminess a bit more doable, for those people who don't like it at all, I think.
Yeah.
And you just brought something up
Yeah.
with food source, and what do you think about wild game birds? Because some people will be like, one of my coworkers, Shave, he's listening. He's been in the podcast a lot. Love the man, and he always tells me like, you can't eat mergansers, or they always say, or people always say, you can't eat certain wild game. What do you have to say to that?
It 100% depends on what that species is eating. And I will say, like, that first year that we decided to only hunt for our meat, we did not shoot a deer, and we shot a lot of waterfowl. Like that waterfowl, that was our red meat. So we primarily only ate ducks, geese, pheasants, and rabbits, and did some fishing. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times I like had to make diver ducks work, and the only time I've ever really been successful was brining it and then putting it into gumbo. Uh but it's rich. It's not, I will agree. I don't like diver ducks because they're eating aquatic species. Um, and I'll say, one of my favorite things to eat in the world is a big, beautiful, fat mallard. And last year in North Dakota, everybody's like, a mallard is like a pretty general like a animal that like everyone agrees that it's going to taste really good. And so when we went to North Dakota this past year, we got there in late October, and a really big snowstorm had just hit, and like the land was just blanketed in snow. All the all the bodies of water had basically frozen over. And so we found one like little creek with some open water, some moving open water, and there were a ton of ducks on it, a ton of mallards, and we were like, hell yeah. Had a good hunt and shot a bunch of ducks that were going over there. And I got home and started eating them, and I'm like, oh my god, this tastes like a diver duck. My mallard tastes like a diver. And that's because that snowstorm had covered everything, and all they had to eat were all the aquatic stuff at the bottom of that open water. And I think it's pretty amazing how fast their their diet can affect the taste of the meat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think like it's got to be a situation where that mallard has been eating and living that and eating in that area its whole life. No, this is a migratory bird that has probably been eating all sorts of good stuff and then ran out of food and is sitting there eating that for several days. And here I come and shoot it, and I'm like, ugh. But I think that goes to tell you how wildly different animals can taste based on what they're eating and where they're living. And I think that's why a lot of people dog on antelope. I have to say, I I thought one of the best things I've ever eaten was an antelope I shot in Wyoming out on the plains. It was fantastic. Um, a lot of people dog on snow goose. Snow goose. I have not had a bad snow goose. I don't know what people are talking about, and I can tell you, I've eaten a lot of snow geese. I lived on snow geese for an entire year. Like I'm talking, I've eaten over 100 birds. Like we were shooting like about 100 birds a season. So like I've had a lot of birds, and I don't know where this notion comes from. I think it's just a stigma that people get in their head, and I think it's really harmful because the amount of waste that happens in the waterfowl industry is pretty disgusting.
Yeah, I agree. I'm always of the camp, I would say, of, try the food a few times from different sort like areas
Mhm.
and whatnot, and see, like, kind of build your opinion
Yeah,
around that, not what others tell you, because you might have a very different
absolutely.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you try it and you're like, you still don't like it, like, that's fine. I personally don't shoot jackrabbits or diver ducks anymore. And I tell my husband, "Don't shoot them because I'd rather not eat them." I mean, if that's all I have to eat, I'll eat it, but it's not. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can pick and choose now. That I don't
Yeah.
need to eat that. I don't need to kill that bird.
Yeah. That's totally fair. So, I know you also like to use the whole animal in your cooking. And I think that's super
Mhm.
important, especially the organ meats. There's so much nutrients in those organ meats, and I have a whole long blog on the website about it. But hunters usually always talk about organ meats from deer and elk. What about the bird game
Mhm.
animals? Any
Yeah.
advice on how we can use some of those odd bits from the birds in our cooking?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I always save hearts and livers. I don't always save. Sometimes I save the gizzards. It depends on like if I have a bunch of ducks and I have enough gizzards to cook something with. I save them. I'll give them to the dog. If I only have like okay, we shot one duck, I'll probably give that gizzard to the dog because, and I'm gonna like caveat this by saying my dog works really hard and my dog's a better hunter than I am. And he earned that meat too. And so I used to get really upset when I heard people being like, they give their meat to their dog. How horrible. Like, but no, I've kind of changed my mind over the years that I'm like, my dog deserves this probably more than I do. um, but he's a good boy. Um, but as far as the other parts, like the hearts and the livers, one of my favorite things to do, especially with duck, is to if you only have a handful and you're like, well, I can't make a pate because I've got like 3 livers, what am I going to do with it? Chop it up with like some onion and some red pepper, and like make a breakfast hash with it, and then fry an egg over it. That's my favorite thing because it takes no time at all, and it's just kind of an easy little quick meal.
I love that. Yeah, I've never had the organs for
hmm
breakfast, I think. So I'll have to try that out. That sounds really good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's my favorite. That's my go-to with organ meat. Put an egg on it. I don't know
Yeah.
why. I just think it's like nature's like multivitamin there.
Yeah. It gets the day starting right. And you get a little bit of egg yolk in
Mhm.
there with even more nutrients and rich flavor. Yeah, that sounds really good.
Mhm.
So, needless to say, wild game birds can be a delicious food source. And in your book, you kind of make that distinction between dark and light breasted birds. What are kind of the differences there, and how would you treat them differently in the kitchen?
You really read into that book. That was like in the weeds in there.
Oh, I love your stuff. So all good
Thank
content
you.
in there.
Um, sorry, repeat the question again. I
Just like
I was just laughing about
the dark versus the light breasted wild game
uh-huh.
birds, how we should treat them differently in the kitchen. You know, what are some of the things there that we should be considering?
Yeah, so the coloration of that is due to something called myoglobin. It has to do with oxygen being carried into the muscle, and if you've ever wondered why like a wild duck versus a domestic duck are like light red and dark red, or like egg, like a goose is like eggplant, purple almost, and it's because they are migratory birds. They use their muscles more, and they're getting more oxygen into them, and that affects the coloration. But in generally speaking, when you look at the color visually, like you can see that like a red meat bird should be treated like a red meat venison or duck. Yeah, so like that's why with something like sharp-tailed grouse, sage grouse is the same, dove, woodcock, all of those birds are darker meat and like they should be medium rare, still pink in the middle. And then you've got this like little group of birds, partridge. I mean, I think most people would say partridge is a light colored meat, but I think that it's a little bit more a little bit more tinted, and I think that is one that's really good served blush in the middle. And then you've got like quail on the other end of the spectrum and pheasant where you are treating it a little bit more like chicken, but you have to be extremely careful not to overcook it.
I learned that pretty quick with trying to smoke a pheasant, that you got to be very careful there because they don't have a lot
Yeah.
of fat, and you got to be.
Mhm.
I still have to figure out how to do it right, I should say. That's definitely one I want to
I don't
learn
think
how
I've
to
ever
do.
smoked a pheasant actually. I love to smoke turkey legs. Um, Turkey thighs and turkey drumsticks. One of my favorite thing to do is to brine them in just like your traditional saltwater brine for like, gosh, maybe only a day, overnight, like 12 hours at the most. Um, Brine it and then let it air dry in the refrigerator for a while till it's like like pretty dry on the outside, and then smoke it only for like 2 hours. I'm not trying to like tenderize it on the smoker because it'll just dry out. But I'll just smoke it to infuse flavor, and then I'll drop it into the crock pot with a bunch of veggies and some beans, and you've got like this really nice smoked. It's kind of like a smoked pork hock kind of flavor going on. It's really good.
That
That's
sounds
in the
really good.
book. I do it
Yeah.
with wild hogs. Uh, I'll make my own like smoked hocks or smoked shanks um for like a big pot of beans, but it works with turkey as well.
So would you say for smoking most wild game, the brining is pretty important?
Mhm. Yeah, so salt interacts with the muscle protein, and to give like a real short answer, it allows the muscles to retain its moisture whenever it's cooked. So when a protein is introduced to heat, imagine the strands of the fiber like a towel. And the hotter the heat, like the higher the temperature, the more that towel is basically getting wringed out and it's losing juices. So if you've ever noticed like why something is dry, it's like the hotter you cook it at, the drier it is. Whereas like something you do at a lower temperature, there's more moisture being retained. And so salt kind of acts as an insurance to mitigate that moisture loss because it can help the protein like retain that moisture. So when you're brining something, I mean when you're smoking something, it's such a dry cooking technique that you can lose a lot of moisture really fast. And yeah, wild game is so lean. So you have to use really low temperature, brine it first, low temperature, and then pull it off as soon as it comes to temp.
Cool. Yeah. Something I still have to experiment with a lot more. We did a deer leg last year on Thanksgiving. That was amazing, honestly. Smoked deer leg,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
leaving all the fat on there still. I'm a fan of deer fat, especially if it's a whitetail. I've never had a bad experience with wild game or specifically deer fat. I've literally never had that weird textured taste that people always talk about. Maybe it's just me.
I have definitely the waxy texture. Yeah, so the more saturated it is, the waxier it's going to taste, and I think it has to do in large where it's found on the animal. So like on the outer parts, it can be a little bit waxy, but fat like in the muscles, like when you're sort of breaking down the hind quarter and you get those little pieces of fat around it. Specifically, one of my favorite, the sirloin tip. I'll keep all of that. It's like the sirloin tip, it's like the quadricep of the deer or elk or whatever. And it's basically three little muscles sort of encased into one. It's like the football muscle. I always either cut it into big steaks, and that you can see the division of those three muscles, and there's always a big pocket of fat in the middle of each one of them. Or I just roast the whole thing whole. But that inside that muscle is really, really good.
That's interesting. So are you searing the whole sirloin and then just baking it in the oven or roasting it in the oven? Is that kind of how you go about it?
Well, good question. That's actually a recipe in the cookbook.
Nice.
And I have a YouTube video coming out that shows how I make it. It's basically a recipe that's what I think is pretty foolproof because you sear it, put it in the oven at a low temperature until it hits the right temperature, and then you take it out. Just use a little meat thermometer, like an oven proof meat thermometer, so that you can watch how it's cooking. But it's like gonna be like the closest thing to getting a prime rib off of a deer as you can get.
That sounds so good and something I'll definitely have to try this year. I usually, take everything off and just keep that football roast, but then you're like, that cut by itself can dry out real fast. So I feel like I'll
Mhm.
just try to keep the whole thing on there this year and see what I can find your
I do it
video.
at a
I mean, I
really
got
low
the book now.
temperature in the oven,
Like, what are we talking temperature wise?
about 300 or even lower, a little bit
Okay.
lower. Yeah, yeah. It goes back to what I was saying with like I don't know why I always use towels as my visual reference, but yeah, the higher the heat, the more those fibers are twisting and like letting juices out of the meat. So that lower temperature is a more gentle cooking method. It'll be a lot juicier that way.
Awesome. Excited to try that out. So here's maybe a bit of a harder question. I don't want to put you on the spot, but what is the strangest wild food ingredient you've ever worked with in the kitchen? And maybe you have a story with it, if you can think of one.
I guess maybe mountain lion. Maybe that
Oh
does
yeah.
that count? It's
Yeah.
mountain lion. Yeah, I had a I've done a couple podcasts in my son's nursery. I just had a baby, and we have a mountain lion mounted in his nursery. But that cat was the only mountain lion I've ever eaten before, and I was really surprised that it's just like people say that it tastes like pork, but the strange part about it was the texture was more like beef. Really weird. It it's you certainly know you're eating a new animal for the first time, which is
Yeah.
cool. It's really cool, but, yeah, so I treated it like, I had some friends over, and we had the backstrap, and I did I like a pan roasting where I start on the stovetop and seared it, and then I coated it in some sort of glaze. I don't remember what I used. I had some sort of jam and, like, onion and, like, vinegar and sugar, like, I don't remember what I did, but I put this glaze over the top and just roasted in the oven and just sliced it up, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I've always wanted to try one. I still have a piece of mountain lion from Hayden in my freezer that I have to make.
Oh,
So,
yeah?
yeah. Is that in the book as well, Mountain Lion?
No.
Yeah, that's a rare
No.
one.
No, that one yeah, I think yeah, that one so that book, I mean, I spent over a year working on it, and I didn't include it didn't include bear either because I've still have not gotten a chance to cook with bear, which is really disappointing, but, so there's a couple things not in that book just for yeah, I mean, I've only had that mountain lion that one time, and that was that was like 6, 8 years ago, so
Yeah, they're
didn't have
also
any more for the book.
less accessible, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
not, I feel like a lot of the stuff that should be in a cookbook is makes sense to have stuff that people can get their hands on much easier.
Mhm.
Which
Yeah.
with mountain lion is kind of tough.
Yeah.
So I want to get
Yeah.
into some community questions here in a sec because I posted in social media that you're coming on. We actually got a good amount of questions. We'll go over like some of the top
Oh,
ones I
good.
picked if you're cool with it. But
Yeah.
before we do that, real quick, have you fermented any wild mushrooms before? This is something that's come up a lot in the podcast recently.
I don't I don't really do any fermentation. It's just a world I haven't really dabbled in, and I don't know why. I've got David Zilber's book. Um, you know who he is, the Noma guy,
I I
Mr.
not not
Fermentation. Oh, you'll have to I'll send that to you too. He's a genius. He was one of he was head of the firm I hope I'm not wrong in saying this. Head of like the fermentation section of Noma, best restaurant in
yeah
the world,
yeah I did
or so I
fermentation
hear.
is fermentation is a whole world that is really special, and I've dabbled some in it. Still got a lot to learn too, especially with like mushrooms, but that's something that's just I think still pretty unexplored. Fermenting the wild mushrooms is something I'm
Yeah.
excited to learn more about. Yeah.
Mhm. No, I've never fermented, but I have a recipe for chanterelles where I marinate the chanterelles. So like I cook it first and then put it in basically a vinaigrette and let it marinate. And then I use that to put into a salad, which I think is probably trips a lot of people up. So in Texas, chanterelles will start popping up. as early as late May. June is really a great time because there's still a good amount of rain and it's not too hot out. And so at that time of the year is also when we're getting apricots and heirloom tomatoes on the vine. And so I made like a really beautiful panzanella with the chanterelles, apricots, and the tomatoes. And yeah, that's one of my favorite recipes, but marinating those mushrooms and just, like, putting that on toast is so good.
Yeah, chanterelles with a little butter on toast too. I've never marinated them, so I'll have to try that as well. But
Mhm.
that kind of leads into our first community question, which actually was about chanterelles. So Christina asks if you have any tips on how to get the most flavor out of wild chanterelles. I have heard a lot of people say that chanterelles just don't have enough flavor. Have you experienced that?
I know what they're saying, and I think it's because we compare them to other mushrooms, which are really earthy. Chanterelles are not like a porcini or a shiitake or anything like that. They're delicate, they're more floral, they're just different, and I would agree that it's easy to lose the flavor, so, like, going back to what I was talking about when you eat with your nose first, what you smell, you can when you smell a really fresh picked chanterelle, you get a combination of, like, petrichor, um apricots, some of that fruity flavor, but there's some sort of like floralness to it that I always pick up, and it's really subtle. It's so easy to lose that when you cook. And I cooked with Kevin Gillespie one time, and he showed me a way of cooking with them that I will probably do now forever. And that's that you basically get a pan of butter really hot. You can brown butter on the stovetop, add those chanterelles in, take it off the heat, and let the residual heat cook it through. Like it's just such a brief way of cooking them. For like smaller ones, like here in Texas, like we get our chanterelles are a lot smaller. We get a lot of cinnabars. I don't know if you're familiar with that variety. They're bright, vibrant, orangish red, and they're much smaller. Um, then like this like I don't know the proper name, the smooth one, which is like a thicker, meatier version of a chanterelle. And so you can cut them up and smaller, but it's a really delicate way to handle them that allows you to still pick up on those subtle flavors. But I one time I wanted to make I still want to make a dessert with chanterelles because I think there's something about it that the fruity floralness that lends to something, like a really soft, airy dessert, but I can't put my finger on what that's gonna be yet.
Yeah, I love that idea of chanterelles in a dessert because of that flavor. And it's also cool to hear. I've never thought about just using that low residual heat. So I can see how that really hot heat for long periods of time could kind of take away that flavor.
Mhm.
That makes sense to me. So that's a great tip.
Yeah.
I'll have to try that. So let's see what else we got here for community questions. Fabled Raven asks, "What's your favorite wild game bird to hunt and eat?"
Easily sharp-tailed grouse. I absolutely love hunting them. We lived in North Dakota for about 5 years, and I absolutely fell in love with the grasslands and the landscape up there. We go a lot of times out on the western side of the state, um, just either you got the south unit and the north unit of Teddy Roosevelt National Park, and there's some public grasslands on it, like sort of sandwiched in between them. And in those areas is a great opportunity for grouse, and it's just a place that I love to hunt.
Yeah, I've never had sharp-tailed grouse, but I'm hoping to get into some this year. I supposedly found some areas from people that have told me about them where they are, so hopefully I'll get some That'll be
Yeah.
a fun
Yeah,
one to
treat
hunt,
them
I
similar
think.
to duck. I've only have one recipe in the cookbook, and it's got, so what oftentimes we find them in buffalo berries in North Dakota. I don't know, I'm sure you've got them
Yeah.
where you're at. Um, yeah, a lot of times they eat those and they're super tart little tiny red berries, and so, I wanted to sort of find a way to replicate that, once I got back home, which in Texas, we don't have buffalo berries. And so I thought, "Oh, you know what's perfect? A raspberry that's been frozen." So a frozen raspberry, when it defrosts, the segments all fall apart into those little bitty balls, and it's just got all this juice that can get real syrupy, and it's really great to sort of make a bright, beautiful, vibrant sauce that, is has enough acidity that kinda cuts the richness of that particular meat that I think is really good.
Okay, great tip. Noted for sure. We got a few wild raspberries in the freezer. Found a giant
Mm.
patch this year because out here we actually don't just have the black caps, the black raspberries. I found like a probably 20 by 30 yard patch of just nice red raspberries in the mountains, which I'm pretty pumped
Wow,
about. Yeah, they're like
that's
prime.
cool.
There were so many this year. The berry season in general in Montana was incredible this year. I don't know how it was for you down in Texas. I know you were busy with the kid and moving, but we got after a lot of berries this year.
Yeah, it's funny, talking about seasonality. Our wild berry is called a dewberry here in Texas. It's similar to very, very similar to a blackberry, but technically in a different genus. And they come between Easter and Mother's Day is like kind of the window in which I start to see them pop up. So it's spring. So I have those in my spring chapter. So I always find that funny. Because you guys are not picking berries till like what, August, July,
Yeah, usually
or do you get
July.
it earlier? Yeah, there's a lot of berries in Montana. We
Oh
don't have
yeah,
as many. Y'all are lucky.
yeah. That's definitely one of the best wild food source to go after out here. Learn the berries. They have a lot to
Yeah.
go after and learn about. So
Mm-hmm.
moving on, there's a question from Shay Helm. He said, what's a wild game protein source that you have to put a lot of lipstick on, that you really have to church up for it to lead up to its potential? We kind of touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, to live up to its potential. That's the interesting little twist at the end.
Yeah.
Because usually anything that you have to dress up or overwork, implies that the quality of the meat is not as good. Something that is just outstanding all on its own, like just a really well cared for, um steak from venison or elk, I'm a salt and pepper girl. I really love to keep it simple. Maybe some herbs in there. But if it's something that needs a little help, like what we were talking about with diver ducks, then yeah, I would still go back and say, you know, up the spices.
Up the spices, maybe add a nice sauce to it. Do you ever inject the meat with anything? I've never really done any of that.
Oh, no. No, because usually those kinds of meats I tend to braise and slow cook anyway. It's not something that's going on the grill, or but that's what I think of when injecting things. I think of something that's going to go in the grill, or like a, I don't know,
Like
buttered
roast.
up turkey or
Yeah.
something. Which that's another thing. Like, I don't mess with the turkey. I think wild turkey's very, very good. Don't Sometimes less is more. Oftentimes, less is more.
Yeah, I would agree with the turkey there. So this one's kind of random. From D Lampert 97 asked, "What's your favorite way to make or brew coffee?"
Oh no. I drink decaf. I had to get off caffeine because I'm naturally
Oh,
like a pretty wired person in the morning, and so I'm the only one drinking. So I drink decaf, and my husband drinks caffeine, and he's actually the coffee snob. He's the one who likes to pick out his beans and grind them, and he does the pour over. He'll boil his kettle on the stovetop and do pour over. I I'm embarrassed to say I am not a coffee connoisseur. I think I like my decaf coffee with coconut milk, MCT oil, and liquid stevia. And
nice.
I it's yeah, it's less coffee and more of a ridiculous latte, coconut latte. But it's like one of those things that I've just ingrained into my brain that it's like my morning ritual, and that's the way I like it. And yeah, that's I'm embarrassed to say that.
Don't be embarrassed. That actually sounds amazing. I mean, I did keto forever, and the buttered coffee or coconut cream with coffee is super tasty. Like I can see why you've made it kind of
It
your
is
routine.
good. Yeah, I mean, I like coffee as a spice, like coffee rubbed venison, I think is good. Like I like it like that. Um, but and I can appreciate it. Actually, I got a recipe in the book. It's an interesting one with truffles. It's coffee cured salmon.
Ooh,
And so add coffee to the curing mix with salmon, and then you put that on like a cream cheese toast, and the cream cheese has been infused with truffle. And it's really, really fantastic.
yeah, sounds
That's
like
like
it.
that's like a Christmas celebration there. That's a fancy one to serve with a bunch of friends and get real excited about something.
Yeah, and if people can't get truffles, they can probably get a truffle oil much easier to do that at home.
Kind of. Truffle
I,
oil, well, I don't wanna get into the weeds on this one, but I had never had a real truffle until I went to Oregon. I'd only had truffle oil, and I was blown away by how opposite they were. Like a real truffle and truffle oil, a lot of times truffle oil doesn't have any real truffle in it. It actually is, like a man-made. They they ex they replicate the aromatic compound and put it in the oil. Um, but it doesn't taste the same at all. It's totally different.
that's fascinating. I did not know
You
that.
should go up
And
there.
yeah, I should. I should get some truffles. I've never done that.
There's
And
some you can get truffles on public land. It's a really cool thing. Yeah.
yeah, maybe you can give me a few tips afterwards where to go.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I mean, it just goes back to, eat real foods because I would have never thought that the truffle oil is also kind of manufactured like that. I thought they just infused them, like kind of let the truffle sit in that oil to
Well,
kind of get that.
yeah, I think there are some brands that do it that way, and I think they're probably very expensive. I think if you're getting it like from Italy or something, but I think like the commercial truffle salt for your french fries, there's no real truffle in it.
Yeah, it's like the liquid smoke kind of deal. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, last question here for community questions is from Find Me Outdoors, and they ask, "What is your greatest fear as a hunter?"
What is my fear?
Yeah, greatest fear as a hunter.
I mean, I feel like I could take this 2 ways. I made a post ironically the other day, and it's running out of meat, but that's kinda like joking. Um, but, like, in a real scenario, like, the thing I actually get scared of when I'm outdoors, bears. Like, I'm terrified of bears, and so I never apply for tags or anything in bear country. Definitely not grizzly. There's some places with black bears where there's not a lot of black bears, like in New Mexico. I'm like, I can handle that. But like Montana, you guys are crazy. I don't terrified.
Yeah, I mean, I am also terrified of them, but trying to become a good elk hunter kind of trumps my fear of them, I guess. But every time I consider areas that don't supposedly don't have grizzlies over areas that have a bunch.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd much, especially when it comes to camping, overnight trips and whatnot.
Oh God. Yeah, no. Uh-uh.
And I would agree to the idea of running out of meat is for me for sure also one of the scariest things. That's just a non-negotiable. Like if I don't get if I don't filter eggs, then I'm definitely going to that local farmer or next if that ever happens to me out here, I want to get a bison from Northbridge or bison for sure. I think you got one recently, right?
Yeah. I got some ground meat. We were doing an event in Austin, Texas. MeatEater had a tailgate tour. We were going to some football games, and so we were doing some cooking out there. And so they provided some bison to cook, since you can't serve wild game, you know. So
Yeah.
that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's super tasty stuff. He gave us some livers
Mm.
and bones and kidney. So we made some liver sausage, German liver sausage out of the bison liver, and it's very mild compared to beef. At least his
Mhm.
is. So that's really cool. Bison's
That's
awesome.
good.
Cool. Well, Danielle, I think that's all I had from my end. I'm sure we could keep talking forever, but I know you got to get back to the family too. I am personally super pumped about your book. Here it is again. People will be able to get this soon, and by the time they listen to the podcast, it'll be available. Where will they be able to buy this book?
Anywhere books are sold. Um, I did a thing of signed copies at my local bookstore, as part of a pre-order incentive, and there might be a couple left, if somebody wants a signed copy. But otherwise, you can get it at Barnes and Noble. You can get it through the MeatEater website. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really, really excited to dive in and actually start cooking some of the recipes. I think people will have to check out our YouTube. I don't know which one I'm going to cook yet on a video, but I'll find a good one to check out. And where can people find all your other content if they haven't discovered you yet?
Yeah, so most of what if you want an actual recipe, like on a website, themeateater.com is where most of my stuff goes. Other than that, social media, all of my social media handles are my name, Danielle Prewett, and Prewett is spelled Prewett. You can blame my husband for that one.
Yeah. Yep. I've definitely spelled it wrong before. Cool. Is there anything else you feel like you want to get out there that I didn't ask you that you want to share?
I don't think so. I think we touched on a whole bunch of topics. And it was a great conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.